Sometimes it doesn't matter how hard you work. Sometimes the people above you just do not appreciate the sacrifices you make for them. Sometimes tragedy is not a choice, it is inevitable. It is destiny, like in the old Greek stories. And our story today begins very close to Greece. Today we take a detour from our usual Roman adjacent location and move to the east, to the new Rome, to Constantinople. Today we talk about the great general Belisarius. In the videos that I've created until now, I haven't really talked about the Byzantine Empire in detail, so you will have to forgive me, since today we are talking about the specific story of Belisarius, as we will leave the context a little bit lighter than usual. We will go back to Byzantium in due time and be horrendously specific, so do not worry about that. Belisarius wasn't born in a great family. His life began in obscurity somewhere in the rugged hills of Illyria, far from the marble courts of Constantinople. No silver spoon, no famous name, only the sword. As a young man, he entered the service of the Eastern Roman army under the patronage of a rising official, Justinian, the ambitious nephew of the aging emperor Justin. There was something between them from the start, a bond of ambition. Justinian saw in the tall, stoic Illyrian a man who could fight his wars. Belisarius, in turn, saw in Justinian a master who could lift him to greatness. His first taste of war came against the Persians. The ancient rivals of Rome had risen again under the Sasanian kings, and the eastern frontier burned with raids and counter-raids. In 530 AD, outside the fortress city of Dara, Belisarius faced the army of Kadath I. Outnumbered, pressed for time, he built trenches and barricades across the plain. When the Persians attacked, he countered with a cavalry charge from both flanks, shattering the enemy formation. It was a victory, non-decisive, but symbolic. A Roman army, under a Roman general, had stood its ground and won. His name echoed through the ranks. A year later, at Callinicum, he was less fortunate. Pressured into battle, outnumbered again, he barely escaped with his army intact. He offered to resign, but instead Justinian brought him home and raised him higher. By 533, Justinian was emperor, and he had a new vision. He would reunite the Roman Empire, not in name, but in fact. The West had fallen into the hands of Germanic kings, Vandals in Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain. Justinian would take it back. But he needed a sword, and he had only one man who could wield it. Africa would be the first target. The Vandal kingdom, once a terror to Rome, had grown decadent. Their king, Gelimer, had alienated his nobles, persecuted Catholics, and weakened his fleet. Justinian prepared for an invasion secretly. Belisarius was given command of the army, not a vast one, but carefully chosen. About 15,000 men, a mixture of Romans, Huns, and Federates. He sailed from Constantinople with orders to avoid battle if possible, to land safely, and to win Africa with discipline. It was not a crusade, it was a restoration. The fleet crossed the Mediterranean in silence, dodging Vandal patrols. They landed near Caput Vada, unopposed. Belisarius marched north, keeping his men from looting, feeding them from the imperial stores. His discipline impressed the locals, who were used to campaigns devastating the countryside and foraging locally. But Belisarius was a different kind of general. At Decimum, south of Carthage, the Vandals finally attacked. Gelimer had planned a three-pronged ambush, but it failed. One column arrived too early and was immediately attacked by Belisarius and routed. Another arrived too late. The main force broke when Gelimer's brother was killed in front of him. Belisarius entered Carthage not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The city opened its gates. The churches, long shuttered by Arian rulers, sang Catholic Mass again. Gelimer fled west. Belisarius pursued. At Tricamarum, he destroyed the last Vandal resistance. Africa was Roman again. Belisarius had done the impossible. In less than a year, with fewer than 20,000 men, he had crushed a kingdom and restored a province. He returned to Constantinople in triumph. The people cheered. Justinian gave him a procession, a true Roman triumph, the first in centuries. But no general in living memory had received such honors, and it stirred admiration and unease. For Justinian, Belisarius was no longer just a sword, he was a hero, and heroes, in the mind of an emperor, could be dangerous. Still, the empire was not yet restored. Italy remained under Gothic rule, and so, reluctantly, Justinian sent Belisarius west again to fight another war. A longer war, a dirtier war. And this time, the shadows would grow thicker. But for now, Belisarius stood at the peak of Roman glory. Praised by the emperor, adored by the people, undefeated in battle, he had given Rome its name back. But Belisarius didn't know the truth. The truth no one really knows until it hits you in the face. The climb was already over, and the descent had begun. Since the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Italy had lived under the rule of the Ostrogoths. They called themselves king, but ruled as guardians of a dead empire. Justinian called it blasphemy. The Senate still sat in Rome, the law still echoed Latin traditions, and in Constantinople, the emperor saw it as a stolen inheritance. So Belisarius sailed again, first to Sicily. He took the island without bloodshed. Remember, Belisarius had taken Africa between 533 and 534. He then landed in Sicily in 535, a breakneck speed for the times. Between that same year and 535, Belisarius went to Africa to crush a revolt and then back into Italy, mainland Italy this time. He marched on to Naples. The city resisted. Its people were not soldiers, but they were stubborn. They trusted in their walls and in the Goth capability to relieve them. Belisarius offered terms they refused. So he laid siege, not with fire, but with engineering. Roman engineers tunneled beneath the walls silently, day and night. When the breach came, it came like thunder. His men poured in, the city fell, and Belisarius did something rare for a general of this time. He stopped the slaughter. He placed guards at the gates. He protected the civilians. The people were not his enemies, he said, they were Romans. From there, he marched on Rome. The Gothic king, Theodahad, fled in panic. The gates opened without a fight, and for the first time in nearly 60 years, a Roman general stood within the city, not as a barbarian vassal, but as a representative of the emperor. It should have ended there, it did not. The Goths regrouped. They crowned a new king, Vitiges, and descended on Rome with fury. What followed was not a campaign, it was a siege, a slow, suffocating death that lasted over a year. Vitiges brought an army of 40,000 men. Belisarius had 5,000. He had no supply lines, no reinforcements, no promise of relief, and yet he did not retreat. He closed the gates, manned the walls, and turned the ancient city into a fortress. It was 537. The Goths attacked again and again from every gate, from the rivers, by the night, and by storm. The Goths tried to starve the city, to drain the aqueducts, to breach the walls. Belisarius answered with mines, ambushes, counterattacks. He manned the walls with archers, moved like a ghost from wall to wall, whatever the fighting was fiercest. Procopius wrote that he fought as though he alone were Rome. And still the city starved. The Tiber ran low. Corpses piled in the streets. Disease crept in, slow and quiet. But Belisarius held. He harassed the besiegers until the Goths themselves withered. By the end of 538, They lifted the siege. Rome had not fallen, it had endured. The miracle was not divine, it was from a man. But while the battle raged, another enemy steered behind him. Envy. In Constantinople, Justinian grew uneasy. Belisarius had conquered Africa and now stood as a virtual ruler of Rome. The emperor began sending rival generals to Italy, dividing authority. One of them was Narses, a eunuch court official with little field experience but great imperial favor. He undermined Belisarius at every step. That was his purpose. They argued over strategy, over orders, over supplies. The campaign fractured. Cities were lost, civilians suffered, the war dragged on. In 540, Justinian recalled Belisarius to the east. But just before he left, something astonishing happened. The Goths, desperate, offered him the crown of the West. They would surrender Italy to him, not as a general but as an emperor. It was a trap, perhaps, or perhaps a genuine offer. No one can say. What is certain is that Belisarius pretended to accept. He took the offer, then took their surrender, and then declared it all in the name of Justinian. He gave up a throne for loyalty, not out of fear, out of duty. And for that, Justinian greeted him with silence. There was no triumph, no fanfare, just orders to head east again. Persia was invading, and the empire needed the best of its generals. But the emperor no longer trusted Belisarius. He sent him to fight without real command, without full authority again. Belisarius obeyed. He always obeyed. He had saved Rome, not just the city but the ideal. He had bled for it, suffered in its streets, starved beside its people. But there were no songs for him, no statues, just dust and silence, and orders to march again. When Belisarius returned from the east, he was older, not broken, not yet, but worn down. Too many miles of march, too many wars, too much silence from the palace he had spent his life serving. Justinian kept him close, but kept him idle. A general with no command, a sword sheathed by fear. There were whispers that Belisarius was too popular, too noble, too loyal to be useful. Loyalty, in a suspicious court, is a dangerous thing. But the emperor was not finished with him. In 545, a new crisis pulled him back into the nightmare he had once escaped, Italy. The Gothic War had not ended after all. A new king had risen, Totila, and he was no puppet. Where Vitiges had failed, Totila triumphed. He took city after city, not just by the sword, but by policy. He offered fair terms, paid his men, and punished looters. Exactly like Belisarius, Totila understood that war was not just battles and sieges, it was hearts and minds, especially when you fight for a complex and rich territory, such as Italy, even if it was already dilapidated by war. In the midst of chaos and war, the Italians were beginning to see the Goth not as a foreigner, but as order reborn. Rome fell again, this time not by fire, but by betrayal. The garrison opened the gates, the eternal city changed hands, while Constantinople debated about what to do. When finally Belisarius was asked to return into Italy, he went without hesitation. He found Rome emptied of soldiers, its gates broken, its people half-starved. He did what he had done before, repaired walls, rallied what few forces he had, scraped together provisions. Again he made Rome into a fortress. Again he stood alone. But this time something had changed. He had no support. The treasury sent no gold. The emperor sent no troops. Supplies promised never arrived. He was left with letters and faith. Still he defended the city. Still he harassed Totila armies. Still he made the Goths bleed for every mile. But he could not hold forever. He begged Justinian for reinforcements. None came. He begged again. Silence. It was as if the emperor wished him to fail. And so, finally, Belisarius did what no general would ever admit to do. He gave up the war, not in betrayal, but in exhaustion. He requested to return to Constantinople. Permission was granted. Rome would be left to its fate. After coming back to Constantinople came the years of waiting, years spent in quiet. He was not dismissed, nor executed, nor disgraced. He was simply passed over. The empire no longer needed heroes, it needed bureaucrats. And Belisarius had only been one thing: Rome's sword. Justinian didn't trust heroes, didn't trust anyone who could put his rule into question. Time passed, and Belisarius was old when the next call came. One last time, in 559, a horde of Huns, the Kutrigurs, crossed the frozen Danube and poured into Thrace. The imperial army, scattered and weak, could not stop them. Justinian turned to the one man who had never failed him, at least when given proper support. Belisarius, now more than 60, partially blind in one eye, forgotten by history, gathered a force of farmers, veterans, and guards, a few thousands at most. And with them he rose north. No armor of gold, no banners, just one last stand. He caught the Huns by surprise, routed them, drove them back across the river. The empire was saved again, because of him, and yet no honors followed, no reward, just a slow fade into the margins of power again. Then the final insult. In 562, rumors began to swirl that Belisarius was involved in a plot against the emperor. There was no evidence, no confession, only whispers. He was arrested, tried, found guilty, his name blackened, his dignity shredded. For a brief time, days, perhaps weeks, he was stripped of his wealth, his position, his status. The legend says he was blinded, that he stood by the road, cup in hand, asking passerbys, "Date obolum Belisario." Give an obol to Belisarius. Now this story is almost certainly a legend, but the fact that it could have been believed tells a lot. Eventually, Justinian relented. The charges were dropped, Belisarius was restored, a final cold gesture. No apology, no reparation, just silence. He died in 565 quietly, with no army, no parade, no senate to mourn him. Justinian died a few months later. For centuries, Belisarius lingered in the shadows of history. He appeared only in footnotes, overshadowed by emperors and kings whose legacies were louder, if not greater. Justinian had killed his memory, destroyed it. But in the end, his story returned to light. Enlightenment thinkers of modern times saw him not as a conqueror, but as a martyr in armor. In him they saw the image of virtue betrayed. Montesquieu praised his character. Artists painted him with colors and symbols of martyrdom, the symbol of the tragic fate of those who serve with honor in a world ruled by lies and fear. So perhaps Belisarius was given that final triumph. It's difficult to say if the image of a hero he has now is too generous, but what we know is that he turned into a synonym for heroism, a silent heroism, the warrior who led the last stand of the Roman Empire of old. There are of course many stories behind this, the story of Justinian himself, the story of Theodora, wife of Justinian, and bitter opponent of Belisarius. I wanted to keep this clean and quick for you, but we will revisit all of this in time. For now, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I'll see you soon for the next one. Have a good one.